part. The mentor and mentee screening. I'm Natalie Foster, the executive director here with Mentor Virginia. And I also have Sarah Wilkinson, our programs manager, that will be helping with the workshop. So again, if you're not familiar with Mentor Virginia, our mission is to foster quality mentoring relationships that empower, elevate, and encourage young people. For those of you, just take a moment to put your name in the chat box, your mentoring program, and your role for us. And as we're doing that, I'll throw it back to Sarah for just a moment.
So for those of you who may not know, this is part of a larger workshop series with 8 different workshops, all about the elements of effective practice for mentoring. We're running this series, we started in July, we're running it through December. And if you attend all 8 workshops, there will be a certificate at the end in the elements of effective practice for mentoring. And share this in the chat today with you all. We do have a companion workbook that kind of goes along with this piece of the workshop series, and all the resources and information we're talking about today, there is follow-up information in that companion workbook. So we'll be referring to it throughout the workshop today. And also just want to let you all know that we do have a no-cost consulting service that is available for programs. So if you want customized support on any element of your program, including screening, that is available to you all, and we'll send more information about that as well. And then for those who might not be familiar, today's workshop and every workshop in the series is based on the elements of effective practice for mentoring, which are national best practice standards in the field for youth mentoring. We are talking primarily based on the needs of one-to-one community or site-based mentoring settings today, but there are additional supplements to the EEP that provide guidance on other program models, such as peer mentoring or group mentoring, for example. So thinking through what screening might look like in those particular program models, we would recommend looking at the supplements for that information.
I just want to go over a few ground rules again about the participation, respect, inclusivity, and confidentiality in shared space. Everyone is welcome to participate today. We will have a poll, some opportunities to chat in the chat box, and one small breakout activity as well. Everyone has the right to pass, you don't have to participate in discussion or exercise. And again, we acknowledge that there are individual perspectives and values. We agree to respect everyone's opinions on this. It's a no judgment zone. Everyone agrees to include all members of the group. Confidentiality outside the group is preserved. Everyone fairly shares the airspace. Group members agree to minimize side conversations. So today our workshop objectives are to understand how to screen mentors for safety, suitability, and fit. We also have a section in here that will look at screening for mentees. We're going to provide frameworks and tools for screening mentors and mentees, and identify red flags to look out for during the screening process, and practice thinking through various screening scenarios. So again, part 1 is going to be focused on mentor screening. And we're going to begin our session with preparing to screen. So, like I said, we'll talk about mentors in this section, but the EEP does have benchmarks and enhancements about screening youth. We're screening for safety and suitability. So, just kind of want to review the two major goals of screening in and screening out. So screening out looks like unsafe adults, and screening in is suitable mentors, that they're committed to the mentoring experience, have good judgment, have the ability to connect and build relationships. So how many of you have planned a screening process? You can just put yes or no in the chat box. Okay, it looks like we have kind of a split of yes and no. So some of you are here to learn more about it. Some of you already have a process and may be evaluating that. So let me ask Laura, you mentioned that yes, you do have a screening process. What's the goal of your screening process?
Our goal is to find mentors that are appropriate for the program and the kids that are in the program. And, if there's any red flags that we see, we kind of screen them out, and, people that might not be appropriate for the program.
Okay, great. Has anyone been screened as a mentor themselves? Ramika, you mentioned that you've been screened as a mentor yourself. Can you tell us, what were they screening for?
Sure. So I was screened through the Big Sisters of Rhode Island program to become a mentor many years ago. And at that time, they were looking for, best fit match for their teenage girls. They were also looking for safety. So they wanted to ensure that I passed a, local, state, and national background check. They wanted to make sure that I had the time commitment that was necessary to devote to their program, which required a 1-year commitment. They wanted to assess commitment to make sure I understood what that meant for their program. They wanted to make sure that I had the sensitivities needed to work with their girls and the different needs that they had. They wanted to make sure that I was committed to following their program requirements, the policies and procedures, and just a bunch of really important and helpful specific information that applied to them. And it was a very thorough, very detailed, very involved process that was all necessary. And it took time. It wasn't a quick, easy process.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
And we'll talk about many of these things throughout the workshop. So you'll notice everything that Ramika was talking about, we'll be talking about as well. We're really looking at what are we screening for? We're going to screen for safety proactively, not out of fear. And just as Ramika mentioned, having clear written eligibility and ineligibility requirements. So we're not discriminating. Gives clarity on who is appropriate and helps check our bias as well. So we will talk about that. And again, document if your gut is telling you something, you need to probe further. So let's take a look about that a little bit more. So really that screening for safety, it's to keep youth safe by ensuring that mentors will not be physically, mentally, verbally, or sexually abusive towards youth. So you see some items here for screening out individuals who are on an unacceptable risk. They lack the time, judgment, or necessary skills. I know that Ramika was just talking about the time piece, the time commitment, will be resistant to coaching from program staff or show a lack of willingness to learn. And then again, screening for suitability. So to have suitable mentors who respond appropriately to the needs of the youth and who demonstrate good judgment and who prevent early closure as well. So, that's the goal here. I'll give you a minute or a few seconds, just kind of read through those points as well. So screening to manage risk. Really, this is the screening process starts with the mentor job description, the written application, a personal interview, background checks, pre-match orientation, pre-match training, and ongoing training and monitoring. You know, all programs must have a solid screening process and communicate clearly the eligibility and suitability. So like I said, through the written application, we'll go through this a little bit more in the workshop, but in order to determine what is an acceptable risk for your program or what is an unacceptable risk. So you're gonna, with the written application, find out information, desire, and drive, the personal interview, see someone, you're gonna be able to read their body language and hear intonation. Even if that's through a virtual meeting. The background checks, state specifics, know the laws of your land, protection from liability, and the written consent to the minimum duration and time commitment. You know, I will make one little note here too. For peer mentoring, you cannot conduct criminal background checks for youth under 18. So when we get into that section, just kind of thinking about that. There are minimum Virginia state requirements, but programs can be more stringent. You get to choose in that section. So, and I will see here, let me ask Meredith, why do you think orientations, pre-match training, ongoing training, and monitoring are involved in screening?
Well, it's important to be able to get to know the mentors or get to know the people beforehand and just make sure that, because a red flag could pop up later on during the screening and you want to make sure you're being aware of that. You can't just have one interview and say, okay, they seem fine, because it's a process and you need to see how they are throughout, because something could pop up later that you didn't see at the beginning.
Right, excellent. Yeah, so even though we're kind of talking about this, I don't want you to just think of screening as a one-time thing. The screening process never ends. It continues screening during matching and initiation and monitoring and support, as Meredith mentioned. And the EEP toolkit has a number of templates that can be adapted to your program. So we'll look at those a little bit later, but we definitely need criteria for accepting both mentors and mentees into our programs. And we have a sample mentor eligibility policy here for you to take a look at. If you notice during the presentation in the bottom right-hand corner, a turquoise triangle, that's information that is available in the companion workbook as well. So wanted to let you know, you don't have to write everything down here. It will be in the companion workbook too. So you can see with this eligibility, they put forth an age requirement, a geographic location. Again, looking at those written program policies and procedures, the commitment time period, both year-long and how many hours a month, and looking for communication as well. I'm going to let Sarah explain the disqualifying mentors.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. So Natalie already mentioned a little bit about needing to establish that criteria for accepting as well as disqualifying mentor applicants. And so when you're at the beginning of your screening process, really taking the time to think through this question, what does it mean to not be qualified to mentor in your program specifically? And thinking through, how is your program going to screen for those eligibility requirements, making sure that those are met? How are you going to know if your core values align with the candidates you're screening? How are you going to know if they have the desired qualities that you are looking for and that a mentor needs to be successful with your program model? How are you going to know that your goals are aligning? And how will you ensure that, to the best of your ability in your screening process, that they're going to be able to commit for the entire, whatever that minimum length is that you're requiring, that they're going to be able to commit to that?
So just kind of briefly looking at the 4 key traits of a mentor. Can't stress it enough, the dependability of them, keeping their commitments, showing up on time. Are they adaptable? Are they respectful, adhering to the program and family rules? And resilient? Can they handle common youth testing behaviors? So looking at these traits, are there other traits that are important to your program? And you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you have one that you'd like to share with the group.
I think this goes along with dependable, but consistency is really important in what we look for in a mentor.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would like to add being able to be real and be present. I think that's a big part of being a mentor and being able to connect.
Right, I agree. It's more than just having the time commitment and being there, but like you said, being present, being very focused on the youth, and being real with them.
Yeah, I would like to piggyback on that one, being authentic, like truly being yourself. Youth can sniff out a fake person quickly, and that can destroy any potential for a relationship. And then the other piece that I would think definitely needs to be included is patience.
Absolutely. And many times mentees will even call mentors out and say, why are you doing this? So being prepared to have a good answer for that. Why are you here?
Yeah, I would say, and I think you touched upon it a little, Natalie, is just being mentee focused in every way, like recognizing that the mentee is the most important person in the match relationship. And that's not to say the mentor is not, but I've found that sometimes mentors can come in with their own agenda, that kind of overshadows the real needs of that younger person or the mentee. So through all of the ups and downs and the challenges and the highlights, it's important to always remember that the needs of the mentee are at the heart of the relationship.
Absolutely. I think with that screening process, when you ask a question like, why do you want to mentor? If you're hearing more things about what they're going to get out of it, that could be a potential red flag right there. So moving on to, what your program should not kind of do in the screening process is to require skills or education licenses that aren't necessary. So really thinking about that. Is it necessary or not? Be sure not to invade the applicant's privacy, but have enough things where you can do your due diligence. Rely only on background checks when evaluating an applicant's appropriateness. Background checks are only one component to a full screening process. And we'll talk about that when there may be some exceptions. I'm going to let Sarah kind of explain some of the resources that we have available in this section.
Yeah, so in the companion workbook, you'll find several resources that will help in preparing your program to screen. So the EEP has an entire chapter on screening. So you'll find that, as well as 2 worksheets with some questions to help you kind of brainstorm and think through what does suitability mean specifically for your program, as well as, what does safety mean and look like for your specific program and the youth that you're working with. And next slide, we have a few more resources here. There's the full sample mentor eligibility policy. We saw just a snippet of it earlier. There's also a sample mentor position description, which can be very important and should align with your eligibility and align with everything that you're screening for in your actual process. And then also some sample safety policies there around confidentiality, overnight visits, mandatory reporting. There are many other safety policies that you'll find in the continuing workbook as well, but making sure that you have those in place before you ever start screening, because you're going to want to be able to communicate that to your mentors, to the families, to the young people that are enrolling in the program, to make sure that you have that, because again, that is important information to be able to share to make sure that everybody understands that you are committed to child safety.
And just to kind of summarize the section, programs that lack a consistent and effective screening process have a greater difficulty sustaining mentor-mentee relationships. So really doing this on the front end will help you to keep those matches for a longer period. Training is the second place to screen. Use your gut and watch for behaviors that would lead to screening someone out. Ongoing screening happens during monitoring and supporting mentor and mentee relationships. And child safety training for program staff should be ongoing to prevent complacency. So next, we're going to kind of look at safe screening. And just a trauma warning here for this section, we will be discussing child sexual abuse prevention. The content may be triggering, so please take care of your personal well-being as needed. So just kind of talking about the stakes here, there is some research that 7% of adults are sexually interested in children. And according to the Crimes Against Children Research Center, 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 20 boys is a victim of child sexual abuse. So we're going to kind of go through some of these red flags of preventing, or having someone that may have some of these tendencies have the opportunity to, have a mentoring relationship with a young person. So if they have a lack of balance, lack of peer relationships, there's extreme behavior, very impatient with the screening process. They just want to be a mentor and are not patient. As Ramika explained, sometimes it takes a while. They have any inappropriate behavior. They're not receiving feedback well, or over involvement with children. They overindulge child youth or unable to set appropriate boundaries. Some more of these red flags: under involvement with adults, difficulty providing references that know them well, focused on personal needs, excessively worries about child liking them. So this is that kind of self-centered piece. Unhealthy attitudes. Applicant shares oppressive beliefs or is limited in their ability to identify their privilege. Problematic personal interests. They give vague answers when asked about their interests. They have a problematic background indicator. They applied or was not accepted or didn't like other youth serving programs. So you may see that they've volunteered at various places, maybe haven't stayed that long. Unhealthy support system, history of toxic or unhealthy relationships, does not currently have a strong support system themselves. That may be, again, something they're overcompensating and hoping to develop a relationship with a young person, but don't have the strong support that they need, which would be inappropriate. And commitment, they will not be, or it's unknown if they will be in the area for at least the next year. So I'm going to actually share a 2-minute video here from Oprah Winfrey, and Sarah has a reference to about a 30-minute video that she has included in the workbook companion. So we're just going to give you a snippet of this. Just let me see here. We had skipped through this. Hold on a second.
How many of you have kids? How many of you? Wow. Okay. So did you learn something from Daniel's story today? I keep saying, I've said it, it's about, I can't even, I don't even know. That's why you need other people to help me say it. That a child molester, everybody always thinks it's like what you hear on the news. That only represents a small, teeny tiny percentage of kids who are molested in this country. Most people are molested by somebody they know because that's how you do it. Most kids are molested by people that they trust, either a family member or a close friend. That is how it happens. And the grooming is what makes it possible. The grooming process, parents often always think that it's going to be some horrible, terrible thing. If the molester is any good, he makes the child feel that the child is a part of it. Otherwise, it can't continue. Otherwise, if it's painful, or if it's uncomfortable, or if it's a circumstance where the child feels like they're going to be challenged all the time, or in some adverse circumstance, they would tell immediately. But because it's a lure, it's a seduction, I think it should be called child seduction and assault, because there's a seducing process that happens, which you've seen over and over.
And the point you made before about how the things have changed, I think that there has been more of a comfort level, thanks to you in part,
Yeah.
people being willing to talk about it. And that doesn't just mean being able to talk about it on a show like this. It also means being able to talk about it to your lawyer, or talk about it to your mother or your father or whoever it is. And that's the key. And that's probably one of the things I should have said when you asked me, how are things changed in the last 15 years? I do think that it's still a stigma. There's no question about it. It's still hard to talk about it.
And much harder for men than for women.
So again, just kind of a brief video on what it is for, potentially a mentor or any person in this scenario to go through that grooming process. And there's a longer video that we encourage you to watch as well. So the next thing that we wanted to talk about is the role of intuition. How do you know when an applicant is just not right for your program? So who's heard of the concept of informed intuition? Or what do you think it means and how you might use it in the screening process?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I'm gonna go with informed intuition is kind of utilizing the experience and knowledge that you have gained over the years, while at the same time kind of trusting your gut when it comes to interacting with the student, interviewing a potential mentor, I should say.
Right, absolutely. So like I said, we are definitely going to be looking at all of those strict policies and procedures with screening, but also making sure that as program coordinators that we're kind of listening to our intuition as well.
I have a quick question. It was actually about the previous slide. Suppose one of my mentors discovers that a child is being seduced, to use the words. They're obviously going to come and tell me, but is there someone in particular that Mentor Virginia would suggest, or an agency they suggest, or what would be that process? Like, is the process to pick up the phone and call the police, or is it to pick up the phone and contact some sort of agency who works with children who have endured such horrors?
So there are mandatory reporting process, and I'll let kind of Sarah jump in as well on this piece as to what the steps are, but it is something that your program should have in place as to, one thing, if the mentee has told the mentor something, making sure that the mentee understands that the mentor would say, this is something that I need to kind of break our trust in this moment to be able to tell someone else, go to the program coordinator, and then the next steps. Sarah.
Yeah, so typically, especially if the child's underage, calling the Child Protective Services is typically included in a procedure like this. If there's immediate danger, or if there's something that very recently happened, of course, calling the police might also be included in that step. We do have a sample mandatory reporting policy that's in the companion workbook. So I would recommend kind of looking at that as a starting point, and then thinking about what does that look like for your specific program. If any of the steps have to change a little bit, if you're serving an older population, for example, some of the steps might look a little bit different. But in general, reaching out to Child Protective Services and or the police, depending on the situation, and then the parent also, if again the child is under 18.
So the next thing that we wanted to kind of talk about are avoiding bias and promoting safety. So being careful of implicit bias and how they may impact your judgment if you're using some of that intuition. Having a team of individuals with diverse backgrounds complete all the screening together. So it's not just one person's point of view. Every candidate must go through the same process, regardless of how they were, who referred them, or their standing in the community. The volunteer application process should be completed and documented before the candidate is accepted. And finally, final determination should be supported and respected by all staff. So again, if you have the capacity, it is a best practice, not just one person doing this whole screening process, but to involve a team.
So when thinking about resources in this particular area, we do have, so when we were going over the red flags, we were just providing one example kind of in some broad categories, but we have a document that goes into and offers many more examples for each of those kind of broad categories of red flags. There's also a book called Safe, Screening Applicants for Effectiveness, and it was written specifically for mentoring organizations around how to prevent child sexual abuse. So that is also a resource. A lot of the information in this training came from that book as well. As Natalie mentioned, there is a longer conversation that Oprah Winfrey has done with people who have been convicted or found to be guilty of molesting children. So she has there's like a 30-minute conversation, and it is very interesting. I highly recommend anybody working with children to watch it, but it is hard to watch. So I will throw that caveat in. And then we also have a sample gift giving policy here. One thing to really, when you're thinking about grooming behaviors, it is very common for an adult to give gifts and to try and win favor and trust in that way, kind of as part of the grooming process. So having some sort of policy in place that limits a mentor's ability to give gifts is an important piece of that kind of puzzle of keeping young people safe in your program.
So the next section that we wanted to go over was the mentor screening, some steps and tools. So I'm going to have Sarah put up a poll for us, and it's about your screening step implementation. So if you could just answer, there are 4 questions there, and submit. First one is your mentoring program offering face-to-face interviews with all prospective mentors. Second one is your mentoring program conducting reference checks for all prospective mentors? Is your mentoring program requiring background checks for all prospective mentors? And is your mentoring program reviewing the social media accounts of all prospective mentors?
Give it a few more seconds. Looks like 66. Oh, all right, a couple more just came in. 80% have participated. Just another few seconds.
Okay, so for that first one, 31% are doing face-to-face interviews, and 23% said not yet, but we plan to. So over half of you. And 8% are still doing that virtual, but like I said, you can still get an idea. So not just doing a phone screening, but actually doing a video screening would be preferred. Is your program conducting reference checks for all prospective members? The good news is that no one responded no. This is definitely a best practice here. And like I said, there are minimum requirements, but your program can also require more. Is your mentoring program requiring background checks for all prospective mentors? Yes. And then finally, is your mentoring program reviewing all social media accounts of all prospective mentors? 15% said yes, 31% said not yet. So this might be triggering a thought for you to add in your screening process. And 8% said no, and we don't have plans to right now. For that question, I'm going to ask that Sarah to actually just jump in real quick and kind of talk about how social media can be used as a screening tool.
So yes, a little bit later, we have a sample link to a form that was developed with the program just to go through, when you have an applicant and you can ask them to provide during the application, provide their, all of their different social media accounts so that you can ensure that you're looking at the right accounts when you're screening. But that can be a way to, see what people are doing in their kind of more personal spaces online, thinking, are they sharing inappropriate photos or videos? Are they expressing oppressive views that might, be challenging for a young person to be with that mentor? So just really thinking through kind of that additional added step of, what are people sharing out there and what is there to find that might not come through in an interview or in any of the other steps that you've got kind of built in there. Yeah.
Yeah, and in addition, if your program happens to allow mentors and mentees to connect through social media, you would definitely want to know firsthand what a mentee may experience first. So we do have a slide here on mentoring screening steps. And again, this has the turquoise triangle. So all of this information you can kind of briefly review here and dive into a little bit more in the companion book. But it is broken down from community-based, site-based, and those that are unsupervised and those that are supervised as to what's required, recommended, or optional. So kind of thinking about that mentor orientation, if you recall, we said, screening or the application is not just the only time that screening is involved. It is during the mentor orientation. So it's an opportunity to establish your program's commitment to child safety by reviewing safety protocols, can serve as an additional screening step, and prospective mentors can self-determine whether there's alignment between their values and the program's values before applying. Let Sarah talk about the mentor application.
So, every program has, every application looks a little bit different from program to program, but it is the best practice to at least require some sort of application be submitted. And some of the things that you might be asking about, employment, education, legal history, about an applicant's availability, just to make sure that that's even going to align before you get any further in the screening process. What their motivational statement is, like why do they want to become a mentor? You might be able to figure out pretty quickly that somebody does not have an appropriate reason for mentoring even before they get to the interview step. This is also a great point to collect those personal professional references, which you can conduct those reference checks, and signing off as well on some sort of kind of release statement, agreeing to all the steps of the screening process, being able to check their background check records, things like that is also a best practice. And we have some examples later on for that as well.
So things to look out for in the mentor application. Again, completion of the application. Are there any omitted answers, or why is there a gap in information? Timing of the submission. Did the applicant follow the submission guidelines? Did they follow through on their commitments? And content, what do you need to ask about during the interview? So you're looking at the application, and is there something that you need a little bit more information, clarification on? Again, we have a mentor interest survey here. And I'll actually let Sarah kind of just talk about how you may use this or why this would be a good tool.
Yeah, so a lot of programs will include some sort of interest survey as part of the application. And this can be not only a good way to figure out, so hey, does this person have interests that align with, you know, our program and what we're able to do in terms of the match activities that we offer. And it can also, if you provide a similar or the same survey to the young people as they're enrolling in the program as well, then you can kind of do a side-by-side comparison and make sure that you have a way to assess interest compatibility as part of the matching process.
And as a mentor that's gone through the screening process myself, you know, it was either done like a checkbox or verbally. And so, you know, I enjoy reading. And so my mentee enjoyed reading too. So again, just as Sarah was talking about, it helps in that process. For the resources here, Sarah?
Yes, so we have a few resources in the companion workbook as well as linked here. There's a tip sheet on developing a mentor orientation plan. There's also a sample mentor application that you can use to base your own program's application on, as well as a sample interest survey that, again, you can customize to make sure that it aligns with what your program is looking for and able to offer in terms of match activities.
In the mentor interview process.
Yes. So when you're thinking about the mentor interview, again, it is the best practice to do some sort of face-to-face interview in person, preferably if that's possible, but not every program. Some programs are fully virtual and have mentors spread out all across the country. So in that case, you cannot do an in-person interview, even when there's not a pandemic happening. But you're thinking about when, so a lot of programs will, you know, do the interview after an application has been submitted to make sure that that kind of first step is met. In terms of the where, so if you're doing an in-person interview, thinking about, you know, where are mentoring activities taking place as part of your program, and does it make sense to have an interview there? If there is going to be the ability for the mentee and the mentor to meet in the mentor's home, it would be a best practice to have the interview in the mentor's home, so that you're kind of having that site visit and you have a chance to kind of be in that space with them and make sure that it's going to be safe and appropriate. And again, as Natalie mentioned, if you have the capacity involving more than one person from your program during that interview, is definitely recommended. That will allow both of you to kind of take turns going back and forth. So you can take better notes. You can also notice, you'll be able to notice more things with the two sets of eyes and ears compared to just one. So thinking about that and how that might help, you know, you'll be able to have a conversation afterward to debrief that interview and make a team decision on how it went.
Some more things to consider in the mentor interview: the motivation, which we've talked about before. Again, putting that in the application process, looking at the history of abuse. What is the applicant's history with trauma? And have they been proactive in their healing, their support network, their experience with children, and preferences? So thinking about the types of interview questions, we have kind of divided them up into 7 different sections. And that first section is the mentor motivation, interests, and experiences with young children. The second one has to do with their personal history and understanding of role as a mentor. Third section is support and relationships. Section 4, logistics. Section 5, mentor expectations. Section 6, cultural responsiveness. And section 7 is actually some mentoring scenarios. So you could potentially give them a scenario and say, how would you handle this scenario with your mentee, just to get an understanding of their communication style and conflict resolution skills as well. So kind of thinking about this, we're going to do an activity. And I'll let Sarah explain the activity.
Yes, so we're going to be breaking out into small groups. At least 3 per group will be our goal, as Natalie is working on that piece. And Natalie, do you have breakout room abilities? Okay, great. So with your group, you're going to be coming up with, you know, 5 interview questions for your assigned category. And we have a we have a cheat sheet document that will help so that you don't have to try to and remember what was on the previous slide. So I'm going to grab that link real quick for you all. But once you're in your group, whatever the number of your breakout group is, that's the number of the category that you'll be assigned to. So you're going to develop some interview questions for that category. And then once you have that kind of those few questions listed out, trying to identify some red flags that could come up as a result of asking those interview questions, or just in your category of questions in general. What are some red flags that are likely to surface? And in that document that I just shared in the chat, there's also a link to a list of red flags. So again, you'll have kind of a resource that you'll be able to use for that process. So, and we hope that everybody will be able to share out a little bit at the end. So making sure that you have a designated speaker would be helpful.
And Sarah, just to let you know, I was not able to do the breakout rooms. I think that you have those controls.
Okay, let's figure that out. All right, I'm going to send you all away there. We're going to have 4 rooms. So one of our, I think I'm going to take out one of our categories so that you all are able to, I want to make sure that the cultural competency doesn't get booted out. So, all right, I'm going to start the breakout rooms. And hopefully you all have the option to join.
So it's Friday morning, so I was like, we're all back together. But welcome back. So I hope you had the chance to kind of come up with some interview questions based on your category, and then again identifying a red flag that might come up when asking your interview question. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from room to room and just ask that you share one of your questions and the potential red flag. So I believe in room 1, it was talking about the motivation of mentors. And so thinking about screening questions, Tammy Mobley, are you able to share with us what your group came up with, one of your questions and a potential red flag?
We did have 5, so okay. For the motivation, we didn't have a red flag for that one, but we did ask, how will you keep your mentors motivated? But I would say, like, one of the questions that we did have that we had a red flag was, how do you have experience working with children from a diverse population or from low socioeconomic backgrounds? And a red flag would be if there any of their biases or judgmental. Someone has said, like, if there's something in the news and they showed, talked about something like racially motivated or gender-based, that was maybe a red flag that we would say probably might not be the fit for the group.
Okay, great. And then I believe in group 2, it was about support or supporting relationships. And Minerva, whoops, sorry, are you available to speak?
I am.
Okay.
So we came up with regarding 3 words in your support system that would actually, 3 people that are in your support system, give up some words that they would use to describe you. And if they were unable to come up with anything, then that could be a red flag for that.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
And group 3, the mentor expectations. Jackie, can you share for your group one question and red flag?
Yes, so the one question that we had was, tell us about a difficult time that you had with a child or adult, and how did you handle that? The red flags we would be listening for would be looking at what they told about, what they discuss as the behavior that the student that the student displayed, and then how was their reaction? Were they angry? Did they have outbursts? Did they use inappropriate words? Were the actions inappropriate? Did they think too fast, act too fast, not think enough before they spoke or said something? So those would be red flags to us.
Okay, great. And Teresa, I believe you were in group 4 with cultural responsiveness. Can you share a question and a red flag?
Right. The question we came up with was, please share your level of knowledge and comfort with discussing issues of privilege and oppression, which we just kind of turned that initial statement into a question, and asked them how would they define privilege or oppression and how it relates to the cultural norms. I guess another follow-up, we had because this is such a big thing and it deals with not only privilege, but oppression, both sides. It says, can you share a time you encountered privilege or faced an oppression, and what was your response to it? And we didn't really get to the point of talking about red flags because we were talking and then we had to leave. So I guess really a red flag for a big part of this, if someone is not even going to be able to recognize that they are privileged, that's a huge red flag. To be able to be any kind of a mentor and be any kind of presence with kids.
Absolutely. I appreciate you guys going through this activity, and we'll get the chance to kind of share some more of these questions, but I will let you know that Sarah has about 9 pages of potential interview questions for you to kind of pick through the different sections and to use as a resource. And really kind of looking at some of the reference interviews do's and don'ts as a follow-up. Looking at that reference section, are the selected references appropriate? The history, how long have the references known the applicant? How well do they know the applicant? Their motivation, again, what do the references think the applicant's motivations are for mentoring? Their commitment and responsibility. Is the applicant someone who is responsible and keeps their commitment? Consistency, is the information being provided consistent with the applicant's information and staff impressions? There are any concerns? Are there any concerns about this person being a mentor? Are there any specific populations of youth the applicant is not appropriate to work with? And finally, just kind of thinking about deciding, through this process, who is appropriate or not. This again with the turquoise triangle means that this information is in the companion handbook for you. I'll let Sarah jump in here.
I think Natalie covered a lot of what's on this. So the kind of the different areas that you're looking for, and just again reiterating that this is a best practice. I feel like in talking with programs in the past, I feel like this is often the step, especially when capacity is limited, that is the most likely to be skipped, and just encouraging programs to make the time and space to make sure you're completing the reference checks. Because otherwise, if you think about it, you're only talking to the applicant about their appropriateness. You're not getting any other perspectives on that. So, and that's a big piece that would be missing if you don't do the reference checks.
So again, with the reference interviews, what are you looking for? You're looking for, what they say, what they're not saying, what they're conveying, how they're conveying that information, their tone of voice, and their level of nervousness as well.
So for your interview resource roundup, like Natalie mentioned, we do have somewhere around 8 or 9 pages of sample mentor interview questions, and they're broken up into those different categories. And those categories were created by Silver Lining Mentoring. They're a leading mentoring program in I think Massachusetts, and they serve youth in foster care. So to give credit where it's due, those categories came from them, and we developed out some questions for your reference. There is also a sample mentor interview rubric that Silver Lining Mentoring also created, and it kind of goes along with those categories. So that's a really great tool to use. You can customize, develop one for your own program. That will help you be consistent in your interviewing process and making sure you're assessing candidates in the same ways, using the same kind of formula, more or less, to make sure that you're not letting things like bias or anything like that creep into your decision making on the interviews. There are also some sample reference interview questions, as well as some tips for how to go about making successful reference calls if you haven't done it before. So in terms of background checks, again, this is a best practice. There are, as we were kind of digging into a lot of the research, particularly in this area, there are so many different types of checks. There are so many different types of records that can be searched within those checks. Every state does it differently. So there's really a lot of different information to consider when you're thinking about what this might look like for your program. In terms of the WIN programs, because background checks might take a long time to come through, you might decide that you want to do the background check before you even do the interview process. For other programs, you might want to wait until after the interview when you know if your candidate is viable or not, because they can be expensive. So just thinking through what's going to make sense in terms of the steps of the process for your program. Again, since background checks cost money, thinking about how is your program going to pay for it? Is that going to be something that you ask your mentors to cover? Are you going to split the costs? Is that going to be built into your budget? Making sure that you've accounted for that piece. In terms of the what, again, there are so many different types of checks. So making sure that your program understands kind of what your minimum of requirement is going to be, and making sure that every mentor that goes through your screening process is hitting those same background check requirements. And there's also, considering who might be involved in that process. For some types of checks, the mentor has to be the one to do it. You might be able to use a private screening kind of company that can do all of those checks for you, or you might be doing some of them yourself. So just kind of thinking through, all the different steps of who is involved in this background check process.
And again, just kind of looking at the different types of records here and noting that not every background check will provide all the information that you need. But this is kind of just like a little pointing you to that right direction. So person arrested, and an arrest report is, there's an arrest record. There's also criminal court records. So just kind of looking through the line here as to how that works. We also provided a key to background checks that you can see here. So, whether it's less rigorous, not recommended, a required benchmark, which you will see with the pluses, those national criminal records, the sex offender registries, child abuse registries, and driving records when relevant. And then the blue star is highly recommended enhancement. More information on those background checks. If a person has committed a crime but hasn't been caught, there will not be a criminal record. So just because that you have done the background check doesn't mean that someone hasn't committed a crime. There is no single database for checking a person's history or character. This number 3 is interesting. Criminal sexual activity earlier than 1996 isn't available to the public through sex offender registries. And name-based checks can result in false positives or negatives. Only fingerprint checks can verify that the applicant and the person who has the criminal history are the one and the same. Some other considerations here. Ensure your program has a confidentiality policy and procedure in place that covers what the program can and can't do with the background check results. Recommended that the programs have all mentor applicants sign an information release before conducting the background checks. And the law mandates that applicants should be given a chance to challenge the accuracy of information that an organization receives from a background check. And I see that we have a hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, how frequently do you recommend conducting the background checks? Is this something that if we have a mentor that's involved in our program, it should be done on an annual basis? Or is it kind of a one-time entry into the program sort of thing, or every 3 years? What is the best practice with that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. What I found when I was looking through the research is in terms of like a full background check, every 2 to 5 years was what I found, and that's a pretty broad range. So I think thinking through again how much risk is in your program. If you're in a higher risk kind of program, maybe doing it more often than the 5 years, maybe looking more at the 2 or 3 end of that spectrum. But the one thing that was recommended to check every year would be the public sex offender registry, because that can get updated. That does get updated on a continuous basis. So making sure that, and again, since that's publicly accessible, it costs money to check that. So that's a pretty easy one for programs to be checking every year to make sure that, especially when we're talking about child safety, that we've hit that bucket and make sure that there are no new offenses against a person that have popped up in the past year.
And Tammy.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I hire people. Like I was just telling my group that I've hired like 8 people to work for me this summer. And I go through Sterling Volunteers, and with Sterling Volunteers, they automatically do monthly checks for my staff. And then I think after a year, it'll say, oh, it's time for a new background check for everyone. So I think it depends also on the program, and then whatever program, whatever you're using as your background checks, they probably send you like some information saying it's time for a new background check.
Thank you. So, and then kind of interpreting those results. Again, this slide has that turquoise triangle, which means all of this information is in the companion workbook. But you really, the lack of a criminal history record can't be used to predict future unlawful behavior. So that's why screening involves more than just a background check. And as Tammy pointed out too, that some of them offer the monthly check-ins and yearly reminders. But some automatic disqualifiers here: prior history of abuse of children, sexual and otherwise, conviction of any other crime in which children were involved, history of extreme violence or sexually exploitive behavior, termination from a paid or volunteer position caused by misconduct with the child. But thinking about what else will disqualify a prospective mentor from your program, kind of having those things in mind. Some, we talked about it though, there could be some mitigating factors. So determine your program's minimum standards for rejection related to background checks. The offense doesn't pose a risk to youth. The level of the offense, was it a felony or misdemeanor? The nature of it, was it violent, involving children? Whether the charge resulted in conviction or acquittal, the type of sentence, whether the applicant successfully completed probation, the date of the offense, how long ago was it, additional offenses to the one in question, and the length of sobriety if drug or alcohol related.
So for your resource roundup on background checks, we have a lot of information because we could really only skim the surface today. So we have a resource that talks about the limitations and benefits of kind of each of the different background check methods that are out there. That guide that Natalie mentioned to interpreting results. So once you have a record check in your hand, what do you do with it? How do you read it and know how to make a decision based on that? There's also some Virginia specific guidelines for background checks. So that, again, every state has different ways of doing this. So there are some Virginia specific guidelines there. And then on the next slide, there are a few more resources as well. And there are some sample forms. So getting consent and authorizing, authorization from a mentor to complete these checks. So there are 3 different kind of examples of what that form could look like and what information could be included in it. And as Tammy mentioned, Sterling Volunteers is, there's a link to them there. That's a service that I think a lot of programs, particularly in Virginia, have had success with. So if you're seeking a private company, that might be a good one to look into.
Just sharing again some additional screening methods. Home visit, if that's part of your program, the criminal background checks, other adults in the home, checking driving records, checking out each applicant's social media and reference call. And Sarah, I was going to say, did you want to share one other thing here on social media?
Yeah, Laura, would you like to unmute and share an example that you had about using social media with your program?
Yeah, sorry, I probably should have spoken up earlier when we were on that topic, but just thought I might share an example of how I screened out a mentor at one point last year. We used to only do phone call interviews because it just wasn't feasible for me to like run all over Richmond and be interviewing face to face with all the mentors that we had. But when we hit the pandemic and everybody started using Zoom, I started doing Zoom interviews, and it's been great because you can read the person's face and kind of see what kind of background they have like behind them and who's around them and things like that. So I was interviewing one college student, and he, as soon as his picture popped up, I was kind of caught off guard because behind him, he had a poster. I think it was a poster of Bob Marley smoking a joint. And I was kind of thrown off by it. I didn't love that he chose to have that behind him in an interview, when he's going to be Zooming with students as well, and they'll see that behind him. And I had a hard time concentrating during the whole interview. So anyways, I was just kind of trying to follow my gut, and I ended up going on social media and trying to search for him there. One thing led to another where he had links that linked to something else that I'm not familiar with. I don't even remember what it was called, but it led me to a picture that he had posted of like a bong on a windowsill, overlooking, whatever his view was from his window. So I ended up just kind of trusting my gut on that and using social media and the Zoom face-to-face phone call, and just ended up screening him out. And I ended up telling him, like, one question I always had for people who did screening, the safe screening, things like that, was how do you tell people that you're not going to use them? I ended up just emailing him, telling him, sorry, we don't have a mentee to match with you at this time. And then he didn't really respond. So I don't know, I just thought I might share that. And also to add that I think, in our policies, we have that we don't need to provide a reason for not accepting a mentor. So anyways, I thought I would share that.
Great, thank you.
So in terms of resources for all these additional screening methods, we do have a sample form that you can use when you're checking social media accounts of your applicants. There's also a sample form if mentors want to be able to do an in-home visit and making sure that, do they have firearms in the home, and where do they keep them, things like that. So there's an example form for that too, and some information on checking driving records in the state of Virginia.
So, as Laura was kind of talking about accepting and rejecting applicants, how would you tell an applicant that you're not accepting them? What details would you include? Anyone else have kind of some experience with this where they maybe had to reject an applicant, and how you explain that to them, or what details you included?
Hi, this is Ramika. I recall when I was a program manager and program director, at times having to reject candidates who were not a good fit. And I typically relied on the standard rejection letter language that the EEP, or the National Mentoring Resource, recommended. Which, conveyed a polite thank you for their interest, and, the fact that we chose, not to move forward with a candidate because, of other candidates being a better fit or that kind of thing. But I do recall one person calling to request more specific information as to why she wasn't moved forward. And, that rarely happened, but it definitely put me as a program leader on guard, or just on another level of awareness to make sure that I was fair to the woman, but was honest. And so I remember that I didn't recall her name right away. I needed to pull her file to make sure that I had the information and could, speak to it, because I wanted to be, fair and honest. And, essentially it occurred to me, out of all of the pool, all of the candidates that were in the pool, she did not have qualifying information that spoke as strongly to being impactful to our particular students in that program as other candidates did. And that's kind of how I framed it and reminded her that it wasn't personal, and then offered an opportunity for her to apply to other local mentoring programs whose student populations were a better fit to her profile than ours were. And I was sure to, conclude with a nice thank you again, for calling and for wanting to learn more. I told her it spoke to her commitment, but if that type of thing rarely happened. And the general rule of thumb from the research is to, choose mentors. You're selecting mentors, who you believe are the best fit for your population. And so considering that not everyone is the absolute best fit, it is a competitive pool. It can become a competitive market, even for really strong and dedicated people who have big hearts. So I just kind of left it at that, and it went over well, but it really caught me off guard, and I needed to, do justice to that moment for someone who was hurt by the fact that she wasn't accepted, which she had a right to. Her heart was in it. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Ramika.
You're welcome.
Again, this one has that turquoise triangle, so all this information is in there. But as Laura mentioned, an organization has the legal right to accept, reject, or terminate an applicant. I think the important part here is to avoid the legal challenges. Have all applicants sign a statement granting the program the right to reject for any reason. And then that final one, whatever your decision, send a copy of the decision in written form.
So after you've, once you've accepted mentors into your programs, keep in mind it is the best practice to have them agree in writing to whatever your minimum commitment is and to whatever your minimum meeting frequency is in your program, so that you have that going forward. And then there are resources here for accepting rejected mentors, including sample language for acceptance, letters for rejection letters, a sample mentor agreement, as well as a sample screening assessment form that could help you kind of assess and keep track of every step of the screening process along the way.
Remember, screening is just the beginning here. Documentation is needed. They're going to require to complete a training, monitoring matches throughout the process. Every 2 to 5 years, as we've been asked this question, do another background check-in for each mentor still in the program. So the next part that we wanted to go over is, screening for the mentees and the family. So I'm going to let Sarah jump in here.
So same with mentor, needing some established criteria for accepting youth and for deciding, what disqualifies a potential youth from participating. And there is this full sample is in the companion workbook, so you can read through that.
So again, I know that sometimes we think that we should be accepting all mentees, but it is really a best practice to have a screening for them too and their eligibility. And part of that is to have a mentee family orientation. So to give them the overview of your mission, your goals, your objectives, so that they know what mentoring is and what to expect, how it can benefit the youth, why the youth were chosen for the program, what is the criteria, what the mentee roles and responsibilities will be, as well as the families, and again, their commitment on their time and flexibility. Ensuring them that there is monitoring and safety in the mentoring relationship, and the summary of your program policies.
The same with a mentor application. A mentee application is a best practice. Getting parent signature if the child is under 18 is a requirement. And you can really use this to start collecting any information that you need for screening and matching, especially if you're not going to do a mentee or family interview as part of your screening process. Making sure you've got all that information that you need kind of through the application process, and that you're offering any of these materials in languages needed by the population that you're serving.
So during that family and mentee interview, it's really a chance for you to build rapport with the family, allow them to ask some follow-up questions, gain some insight into the mentee's family life. Really kind of just dispel any misconceptions about what the program is offering in the mentoring relationship and provide a space to discuss concerns and build the mutual goals. So what are some reasons you might not accept a mentee in your program? If you could just type that in the chat box if you've thought about that. Yep, lack of commitments coming through. Not able to meet all of the criteria. This is a really good one. Laura said, if the parent teacher wants them in the program, but they really don't want to be there. Great. So this is just kind of an activity to get you thinking about what some of those reasons why you may not accept a mentee. Someone said that they had a girl whose maturity level was vastly different from the circle of the other girls. Very good. So determining mentee enrollment, again, some possible reasons not to enroll. If the parent or guardian isn't supportive, as Laura mentioned, if the child's not interested, they don't meet those eligibility requirements, if they're moving too soon. So do they have the time commitment as well? Or the child needs services beyond the scope of mentoring. So in that example, maybe if the maturity level wasn't quite there.
So again, once you've got your mentee, you figured out which mentees are going to be in the program, it's the best practice to have the parent, guardian, and mentee sign an agreement to the minimum commitment for the program, as well as whatever that minimum frequency of mentoring activities. And we have a whole host of resources for mentee screening, all the way from orientation down to the sample written agreement, and all of those are also included in the companion workbook. We do have our next workshop on September 17th. We'll be talking about training mentors and mentees. We'll send out a link for you all to be able to register for that. And if you missed part 1 or 2, we have a resource hub up on our website. We'll make sure you have the link for that, where you can view the recordings. If you want to continue to earn the certificate, you can complete the assessment that's located on that resource hub page as well. And lastly, dropping a link to our survey in the chat right now. Please let us know how this session was in your opinion, and anything we can do to improve going forward and for the next 4 workshops or the next 5 workshops in this series. We appreciate all of you joining us today.
Thank you so much for joining us.